let's dive straight into the thick of it. We're looking at how thinkers grappled with law and justice back in the day. Otanes, in his push for democracy, really hammers home isonomia, equality before the law. It sounds great, right? But interestingly, when Megabusiness and Darius weigh in on constitutions, they don't seem to latch onto this idea of law's inherent value. Then you get Plato's Protagoras, who gives us this rather charming image. Laws are like the lines teachers draw on kids' copybooks, helping them learn to write properly. A bit condescending, maybe? Yet, instead of just saying laws are whatever the current crowd thinks is cool, which would fit Protagoras' man is the measure vibe, Plato has him describe laws as the work of good old lawgivers. So even the relativist nods to the need for wise guidance. But hold on, not everyone was buying that. Many contemporaries were rolling their eyes, thinking, yeah right, wise lawgivers? More like laws cooked up for personal gain. And that suspicion, that cynical view of law as a tool for the greedy, is exactly what fuels Thrasymachus' bombshell. Justice is simply the advantage of the stronger. Ouch. So Thrasymachus doesn't stop there. He takes his provocative claim and generalizes it. If justice is the strong man's advantage here, it's the same everywhere. This isn't just a random philosophical flourish. It's taking a specific critique of Athenian democracy. Remember those disillusioned voices blaming democracy, or kakonomia as the old oligarch put it, for Athens' fall after 404 BC and running with it globally. Suddenly, the whole edifice of law, traditionally seen as a social good, looks suspect. Could it be just a playground for the ambitious and the avaricious, using legislation to line their own pockets? But wait, there's a twist. If humans are naturally driven by greed, pleonexia, then law isn't useless. In fact, it might be the only thing stopping us from tearing each other apart in a free-for-all. Think about Glaucon in Plato's Republic. He lays out this popular idea that law is basically an artificial dam holding back the flood of our natural, unjust impulses. He presents it as common knowledge, but you can almost hear him wince, because accepting this view means accepting that we're inherently bad eggs. It's a tricky position. This brings us to the million-dollar question, the central tension buzzing around the sophistic period. What's the relationship between our raw, untamed nature, physis, and the rules society imposes on us, nomos? How does the individual, swayed by their deepest desires, fit into the collective framework of law? Enter Callicles, Plato's character in the Gorgias. He's practically shouting from the rooftops about dikaiosune, kata fusin justice according to nature. He throws this directly against dikaiosune kata nomos, justice according to custom or law. For Callicles, conventional morality is just a rigged game, designed by the weak to keep the strong in check, to stop them from pursuing their full potential, their natural drive for power and pleasure. Imagine him saying, why should I restrain myself if I'm naturally capable of more? It's a dangerous idea, obviously. Plato puts Callicles in there partly to show the potential pitfalls of rhetoric, the kind Gorgias himself supposedly taught. But mainly, Callicles serves as the villain, the foil against whom Socrates champions the traditional virtuous life. He represents the challenge that Socrates must overcome. Now, let's shift gears slightly and look at a fascinating text preserved by Iamblichus, known as Anonymous Iamblichi. We're probably looking at something from the sophistic era here. This author kicks off with a bold hypothesis. People by nature, he says, are born unable to live alone. They have to band together, yielding to constraint. Okay, so far so good. Sounds like a standard observation about human society. But then comes the kicker. It's not possible for them to live with one another and spend their lives without laws, because doing so causes greater suffering than living alone. Hold on. This suggests that law isn't just some optional social glue, but a necessary device to prevent chaos. And why chaos? Because, presumably, people naturally tend towards greed, pleonexia. Now, this idea that law is needed to curb our natural tendencies towards selfishness is something we've heard before, right? It's the bedrock of Callicles' argument and Glaucon's challenge. But here's the crucial difference. While Plato's characters use this insight to argue that conventional morality is a terrible deal for anyone strong enough to break it, Anonymous seems to be using this anthropology of greed precisely to argue for the value and necessity of law and justice. He's flipping the script. Anonymous drives this point home with a thought experiment. Picture this. Someone is born with superpowers, invulnerable body, immune to illness, enormous, indestructible in mind and soul. For such a person, could power based purely on greed ever be enough? Could they live without submitting to the law? Maybe, you think, they could just muscle their way through things. But Anonymous immediately counters. Nope. Even this superhuman would eventually fail. Why? Because they'd face opposition from the greater number of people who are committed to law and justice. See the optimism here? It's almost utopian. The conclusion? Law and justice rule over people and could not be altered in any way. For these are bound together by a strong nature. Notice the language, strong nature physis. It's almost like saying our nature itself demands law and justice. And get this, the hypothetical figure Anonymous describes bears a striking resemblance to Plato's Caligula. This suggests that this kind of thinking, exploring the limits of natural power versus the constraints of law, was quite widespread and influential in the intellectual circles of the time. Let's hop back to Plato, specifically to the Protagoras. Plato gives us this incredible speech where Protagoras uses a myth to explain how we got politics. It starts bleakly. Humans were just prey for animals, vulnerable and scattered. So we formed societies for protection. Great start. But then the plot thickens. Once inside these societies, we started fighting each other. We committed injustice against one another, lacking the art of politics, leading to scattering and destruction. Ouch. So by nature are humans non-political beasts? The myth doesn't leave it at that. Zeus steps in and gifts us two crucial things, shame Eidos and justice Adikia. With these divine implants, we finally learned to live together. So human nature, according to this myth, is a mixed bag. We have these base tendencies towards injustice, but we also have these socially useful qualities, shame and justice, that allow civilization to function. Politics, then, is all about managing this internal conflict, suppressing our natural vices through morality and law. This sounds remarkably similar to the arguments Callicles makes, and Glaucon attributes to thousands of people, doesn't it? Both focus on controlling our natural inclinations. However, neither Anonymous nor Protagoras explicitly uses the nomos physis contrast in the way later thinkers would. Instead, they use myths and hypotheticals to explore what happens if we ditch morality. Okay, let's turn to Antiphon, another key figure, drawing from fragments of his work on truth. This text is super important for understanding critiques of law. There's this famous fragment, D38/B44a, that drops a real bombshell. It says something like, justice is not about transgressing against the legal institutions nomima of your city. So, a man would make use of justice in the way that's most advantageous for himself, if, in the presence of witnesses, he considers the laws great, but, alone and without witnesses, that it belongs to nature. What does this mean? It sounds suspiciously like Plato's Gyges ring story. The implication is chilling. People only obey the law when they think someone's watching. Take away the witnesses, and suddenly, nature, whatever that means for you personally, takes precedence. Is Antiphon seriously endorsing Callicles' idea of a law of nature? Or is he using this provocative idea to expose the fundamental weakness of law? When there's no oversight, does the law even matter? Given how little survives of Antiphon's work, we have to tread carefully here. Any interpretation is going to be educated guesswork. So how should we read Antiphon? Perhaps he starts by presenting the common-sense view that justice is basically following the law, as an endoxin, something respectable folks believed. But then he throws in that nomos physis contrast, that tension between law and nature, to poke holes in it. By highlighting how law is conventional, man-made, and how people might choose to follow their natural instincts. When they can get away with it, Antiphon seems to be showing the limits of identifying the just with the lawful. He's not necessarily saying, go ahead and be greedy whenever you can, unlike Callicles. Rather, he's pointing out a problem. If law relies solely on external enforcement, and people can opt out when unobserved, then law alone isn't enough to guarantee justice. This connects to Antiphon's broader fascination with the concept of nature, physis, and how it clashes with the conventions, nomos, we impose on ourselves. It's a critique of law's efficacy, not necessarily an endorsement of unrestrained naturalism. Antiphon's skepticism finds an echo in the so-called Sisyphus fragment, a dramatic piece often linked to Critias or Euripides. Here, Sisyphus recounts how the failure of law to stop secret violence led people to invent the idea of a god who sees everything and hears everything. Again, we see the same theme. Law just doesn't have the power to ensure justice on its own, especially when actions are hidden. Like Antiphon, Sisyphus highlights this limitation. But would Antiphon buy the solution proposed in the fragment, appealing to divine surveillance? Probably not. Antiphon seems more inclined to think that the demands of nature ultimately trump the demands of law, and he drives this home elsewhere in his fragments. Consider this passage where he attacks xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. He argues that we treat distant peoples as barbarians, but in nature we're all fundamentally similar. We all breathe, laugh, hear, see, work, walk. The distinction between Greek and barbarian is purely conventional, nomos, not natural, physis. This is another example of Antiphon using the physis nomos contrast to challenge arbitrary social constructs and highlight the ongoing tension between nature and convention. Let's move to Hippias, another prominent sophist. We know about him mainly through Xenophon's Memorabilia. In this dialogue, Hippias engages Socrates on the topic of justice. Xenophon portrays Hippias as initially skeptical of equating the lawful, to boulomenon, with the just, dikaion. How does he challenge this? He defines law as what citizens have written down after having made an agreement, synthemenon, about what people must do and refrain from doing. Based on this definition, he asks Socrates, how can anyone take laws or obedience to them seriously, given that the very people who establish them often reject and change them? It's a sharp critique. If laws are just agreements that can be undone by the same people who made them, what makes them truly binding or just? This approach echoes Antiphon's, challenging the identification of law with justice. Interestingly, Xenophon's portrayal of Hippias doesn't explicitly use the nomos physis contrast, but the distinction between written laws and perhaps unwritten principles or natural inclinations is clearly implied in the structure of the argument. While Xenophon's Socrates ultimately persuades Hippias, this exchange reveals a genuine intellectual current questioning the automatic link between lawfulness and justice. So, where does all this leave us? Plato, writing in the 4th century, titles his two major political works Republic Politeia, Constitution, and Laws Nomoi, Laws. These titles themselves signal a deep engagement with the very themes we've been discussing. Looking back, it's clear that philosophy owes a significant debt to the sophistic tradition, even if Plato often portrayed them critically. Think about Aristotle's massive project of collecting constitutions. Could that not stem from the sophistic practice of constitutional debate? Even Aristoxenus' accusation that Plato plagiarized Protagoras might contain a kernel of truth, suggesting Plato absorbed the sophistic technique of antilogia, the comparative analysis of different forms of government. Far from being mere copycats, the Sophists were crucial catalysts. Their critical examination of law, nomos, and its relationship with nature, physis, directly triggered some of Socrates' most famous arguments, like those in the Gorgias and Republic. And Plato's later work, The Laws, seems to respond directly to critiques like Antiphon's, offering his own solutions. There's a constant dynamic dialogue running between sophistic questioning and philosophical response. But the Sophists weren't just critics. They had distinct characteristics that set them apart from the philosophers who followed. Foremost among these is their sheer inventiveness in argumentation, captured perfectly in the verb sophizein, from which their name derives. This is evident in their practice of antilogia, systematically exploring opposing viewpoints, which naturally required deep reflection on different types of constitutions and political arrangements. This inventive spirit was the framework within which figures like Hippias and Antiphon challenged established ideas about law, and others like the old oligarch attacked Athenian democracy. Closely related to this intellectual agility was their practical bent. The Sophists weren't just armchair theorists, they were professional educators and consultants, skilled in adapting their theories to real-world situations. They provided model speeches, epideixes, both spoken and written, equipping their students and clients with the tools to argue effectively in assemblies and courts. They were masters of rhetoric, applying it to navigate the complexities of political life. Another defining feature shared by many 5th-century sophists is their complex relationship with democracy. Were they democratic theorists? Well, Protagoras, arguably the most famous, likely lived under Periclean democracy and probably supported it de facto. But it wasn't universal. Look at Antiphon, a leader of the oligarchic coup of 411, convicted for treason against the constitution. Critias also acted as an oligarchic leader. So, while democracy in Athens, with its vibrant public life and opportunities for debate, undoubtedly served as the fertile ground, the catalyst for the sophistic movement, their own political leanings varied. Their experiences with democracy, or sometimes its absence, in their home city-states also played a role in shaping their professional identities and perspectives. Despite this lack of consensus, the question of the best form of government, the Constitution, was undeniably central to their thinking. It was a major engine driving the earliest sustained efforts to theorize about politics. In conclusion, the Sophists' critical engagement with law, nomos, and its relationship with nature, physis, was profoundly influential. Their arguments, often framed by that potent antithesis, generated fresh perspectives on the value and limits of law and justice. These weren't just academic exercises, they were incredibly heuristic, sparking some of the most enduring debates in Western philosophy, even if Plato reshaped and refined them. Their role in pioneering political theory, both in abstract thought and practical application, and sometimes acting as intermediaries between the two, firmly establishes their vital place in the history of political thought.